I buried my brother 4 decades ago and lived the rest of my life thinking that was that. A closed chapter, a wound that time softened but never healed. My name is David Carr. I was 23 when they showed me a battered body at the coroner's office after the Kokala highway crash in January 1983. We said our goodbyes, folded our grief into ordinary days, and tried to keep a small family intact. Years later I married Sarah, raised children, and learned how to make ordinary life support extraordinary loss. My mother never got over Tommy. She carried his absence like a physical ache until she died. We lived with that absence until a phone call at 2 in the morning ripped the edges of the comfortable world I'd built. The number was from Vancouver, the voice unsteady and strange, and the first thing it said was my name. For a ridiculous instant I thought of a prank. Then the voice said, "It's me. It's Tommy." The world tilted. I dropped the phone, then picked it up to listen as a man with heavy breathing and lost years in his tone told me fragments, newspaper clippings, a name that fit like a glove, feelings of snow and cold. He had a scar on his left forearm. I remembered Tommy's childhood bike accident, the raised stitches that had marked him for years. The voice said he'd found a clipping of the bus crash, and the name under the photograph read Thomas Carr. He didn't know where he was exactly. He thought he lived in a shelter on East Hastings, in a place they called the downtown East Side. He hadn't remembered much before a dozen or 15 years ago. He knew only flashes: snow, a blue door, the smell of pancakes with blueberries. He sounded like a man surfacing from something long and dark. I told him to stay put. I wrote the address down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and left the cabin before Sarah, half awake, could ask what was wrong. The drive to Vancouver was an ache of impossible hope and devastating fear. What if it was a scam? What if a cruel stranger had read old obituaries and decided to create a ghost to haunt me? And then the other thought, the one that would not be silenced. What if they'd gotten it wrong that January night, and a living brother had been cast away into shadows while the world kept turning? Finding the shelter felt like stepping into another reality. Stale disinfectant, people with their lives folded down to essentials, a television murmuring a show I couldn't name, faces turned toward me in an instant of curiosity and caution. Then I saw him, a weathered man with a ponytail of gray and eyes so like my father's that I nearly fell. He was thinner, older than the image frozen in my memory, but the scar on his left forearm was the same. He called me David with a voice that trembled, and I heard the same small boy who used to wake up hungry for pancakes. He had a newspaper clipping folded and kept like a relic. He said he'd been trying to remember. The clipping had lit something inside him. The possibility that my brother had survived the wreck, been lost to years of exploitation, and only now emerged into memory was a truth too big to hold without acting. If this was really Tommy, then someone, somewhere, had failed him, and the gap between the funeral and this phone call would need answers. When the man across from me unfolded the yellowed newspaper, the photo of a young Tommy stared back like a wound that had never healed. He traced the face with a trembling finger and said he'd started to stitch his life together only recently. Volunteers at the shelter, old papers, the smell of a headline that clicked a dead lock inside him. He remembered snow, screams, and waking up in a hospital some years ago without a name. The fragments were confused, but a scar on his arm and the shape of his eyes made it impossible to dismiss. Still, I needed proof. Memory is a sly beast. Grief and desire could conjure illusions. I told him we'd get a DNA test. If the lab confirmed what my heart wanted to be true, there would be no more doubt. We went to a private lab because time was a kind of enemy. Waiting felt unbearable. Cheek swabs, a mountain of paperwork, a price tag that made my hands hesitate, then an appointment set for that afternoon. On the drive, the old photographs in my head kept colliding with a man beside me, who coughed once and asked what I remembered about our childhood. I told him about blue-checked curtains, the dog we had named Rusty, and Sunday pancakes. He closed his eyes and breathed as if tasting the memory. It was the first time in years I had seen something like recognition cross his face. The hours until the result were long and intimate in a way that hospitals and labs never are. We ate pizza in a cheap hotel and shared quiet stories. He scrubbed for almost an hour in the bathroom and came out looking like a man who had been given a sliver of control back. He asked me what he had been like, a question that landed like a pebble in a pool. I told him Tommy had been kind and stubborn, loud when necessary and secretly tender toward animals. He cried, the sound startled and honest. When the lab called with the conclusive result, 99.9% sibling match, the room dissolved. I hugged him in a way that felt like undoing and mending at once. He said the name Thomas like someone practicing pronunciation of his own life. But the joy of reunion folded quickly into the hard questions. Where had he been between that day in 1983 and when he was found with no papers? How had he aged so quickly? What had been done to him? We sought out Dr. Patricia Walsh at a free clinic who specialized in trauma. Her examination was clinical, fierce with compassion. She noted healed fractures, a depression in his skull suggesting past severe impact, and signs of chronic exposure and possible neurological injury consistent with long-term untreated trauma. The theory she offered was a grim one. Tommy could have survived the crash, been taken from the site or wandered away, found by people who used him for hard labor or exploited him, and then vanished into shadows. Head injuries, malnutrition, and the slow erosion of identity could explain the memory gaps. Her words felt like both diagnosis and accusation. The world had a way of discarding people with no proof of who they were. She recommended an intensive rehabilitation plan and therapies that would take time we didn't have if we were to heal what remained. It also meant confronting legal and practical realities, a false death certificate, records that had long been closed, and a mother who had mourned him to the grave. We had to decide whether to reopen wounds for answers or tend to the softer work of rebuilding a life that had been stripped away. Acceptance of the DNA result forced us into action. The investigation into where Tommy had been would lead to places I had never wanted to go. The first official step was paperwork. I called the coroner's office, dug up records from an event 42 years removed, and requested copies of the file I had signed as a 23-year-old in shock. The photographs, the notes, the stamps, and the hurried signatures looked different in the sterile light of an office than they had in my memory. A detail that once seemed unremarkable took on terrible weight. Bodies recovered after a violent crash can all look like the same heap of ruined things, and under those conditions, identification can be tragically imperfect. I realized the person I had told my mother was dead might not have been Tommy at all. Sandra, a lawyer specializing in cases of misidentification and elder rights, agreed to help pro bono when she heard the story. Her first move was to secure a certified copy of the death certificate and any related records. If there had been a mistake, the chain of custody of bodies, the way victims were processed, and the documents signed in grief would be the trail. She also had a practical eye for immediate needs, medical clearance for my brother, registration at services, and applying for identity documents. We needed to restore his legal existence so he could access treatment and support. As we waded through the red tape, Tommy began to remember small things, the name of our childhood dog, the smell of Mom's blueberry pancakes, and also the shape of routines he had held onto in the fog. He visited the clinic for an MRI and other tests. The scans confirmed the physician's suspicions, past head trauma and lesions that could explain some of his amnesia. Dr. Walsh explained that recovery would be uneven. Flashes of memory might come like waves, sometimes vanishing as quickly as they arrived. It would be an arduous, uncertain process. Meanwhile, we had to confront the past with a new lens. I went back to that January after decades, reading newspaper microfiche, talking to people who lived in the towns along the highway, and tracking down names of the original first responders. A former truck driver remembered a young man walking alone in the snow near an isolated logging road weeks after the crash, but when asked, he had assumed the man was drunk and kept driving. Another neighbor recalled seeing a van headed away from the scene that same night. The clues were thin threads, but they suggested a different story. The chaos of the crash left openings. Someone could have been pulled from the wreckage, mistaken for another, or taken by people who either cared nothing about his identity or calculated advantage from his namelessness. Those discoveries were painful. If someone had taken advantage of a wounded young man, exploited him for years, and then discarded him, then justice was owed, not only answers. But justice would mean going after people or operations that might no longer exist, confronting old institutions, and asking for accountability that is rarely easily found. As the scope of the inquiry widened, I felt the ordinary life I had built begin to tilt under the weight of long-buried secrets. Following the trail from that snowy night would pull us into a world of faded records and stories that people had preferred to forget, and it would demand that I reckon with consequences no one anticipated. As we pursued leads, the landscape of the past started to reveal itself in fits and starts. Old responders provided recollections that contradicted one another, newspaper archives offered small details, and a retired coroner recalled unprecedented chaos at the crash site. None of the recollections provided neat answers, but one pattern emerged. In the immediate aftermath, with roads impassable and rescue efforts strained, several survivors were unaccounted for amid the wreckage. The confusion made misidentification tragically plausible. One contact led me to a man named Harry, a logger who'd worked camps along the Kokala corridor for 30 years. He remembered a young man, thin, bewildered, and injured, who appeared at a remote camp not long after the crash. According to Harry, the boy didn't speak much at first, seemed disoriented, and then gradually absorbed into the labor force. People there took whatever work they could get. Identity was secondary when money and survival overlapped with informal operations. Harry's account fit a common but bitter truth. Vulnerable people can be absorbed into systems where they become invisible. The more we learned, the more complex the moral lines became. If Tommy had been exploited, who bore responsibility? People who found him and decided it was easier to use him than help him? Employers who turned a blind eye? Or a loose geography of neglect that allowed human beings to fall through cracks? The answers weren't tidy. They asked for accountability from strangers who might be long gone and institutions that had shifted hands. Yet the search also revealed acts of small mercy. A nurse in a clinic remembered a young man brought in years after the crash with no ID and a head injury. She had insisted they give him care and documented his presence in clinic records. A volunteer at a shelter had kept newspapers and had shown him the clipping that began his search. These small mercy threads created a map as important as the dark ones. They hinted that not everyone had looked away. As Tommy's body healed enough for more intensive therapy, he began to sit with counselors and piece together memory fragments. Sometimes those fragments were grotesque images of violence or hunger, other times they were mundane details, the taste of a campfire meal or the shape of a wrench in his hand. Each memory opened as if a door slowly being unlocked. We documented everything, filed every paper we gathered, and began building a narrative of the years he'd been missing. But documentation is not justice, and memories are not evidence in court by themselves. Sandra counseled patience. She also warned us about false hope. If exploitation had occurred through informal labor rings or private individuals, proving culpability would be difficult. Still, she filed requests for further records and reached out to investigative journalists who had covered abuses of transient labor in the region. Public pressure might force institutions to take another look. Pursuing records and witnesses would push us toward people and places that preferred silence, and that silence could either hide the truth or crack under pressure. The media's interest came slowly at first, then like a tide. A local reporter picked up the story of a brother found alive 42 years after being declared dead. The human interest angle made for sympathetic copy, and soon an investigative journalist with more resources joined in. Her questions dug into the dark corners, logging camps with questionable oversight, drivers who passed by scenes in the dead of night, and clinics that kept informal notes. The coverage widened the search and brought forward new witnesses. A retired foreman who admitted he'd seen a wounded young man and had told a subordinate to get him work instead of calling authorities. A woman who remembered a van making strange stops near the wreck. An old man who could not forget the look of fear in a young man's eyes. The legal work evolved into something broader than simply proving where Tommy had been. Sandra and I started to imagine a case that named systemic neglect along with individual wrongdoing. We collected affidavits, tracked employment records that showed cash-only payments, and found a pattern of off-the-books labor that made proving culpability both possible and complicated. Proving exploitation required linking people who might be dead, businesses that had been dissolved, or corporate entities that had shifted names. It required accountability where records were sketchy and memories faded. Tommy's recovery advanced in fits. One day he could piece together a sequence of events, the next he'd lose it like sand through fingers. He told stories of long nights in remote yards, work that left scars on his hands, and a man who sometimes guarded him. He used slang that suggested contact with certain crews, names that Sandra cross-referenced with old licensing and registration records. When the pieces aligned, we found a contractor whose company had ties to informal labor use in the 1990s. The paper trail was thin, but we had enough to force questions. As pressure mounted, one of the men who'd once run an isolated camp agreed to meet. He was older now, brittle with age but still defensive. At first he denied involvement, then admitted to taking in a wounded young man, rationalizing that he had given the boy shelter and work. He claimed ignorance of medical needs and said the man had left after a few years. But his memory was self-serving. His version conflicted with clinic notes and the physical evidence on Tommy's body. Sandra warned that many would try to justify their actions as practical necessity, but practical necessity is no excuse for exploitation. The journalists' pieces began to shift public opinion. Conversations in town moved from curiosity to outrage. People who had once walked a blind eye began to ask questions. The county coroner's office reopened some files under public pressure, and a few officials who had long since retired began to talk. The momentum did not mean easy answers, but it meant the story would no longer be ignored. As the public spotlight grew, those who once hid behind distance and informal rules would have to reconcile with the past, but not everyone would be willing to speak honestly. With public scrutiny mounting, institutions that had previously shrugged off loose ends started to respond. The county coroner's office, pressured by journalists and legal petitions, agreed to re-examine the original identification process. They located some of the remaining records and provided access to photographs and notes that had been filed in haste after the crash. The documentation confirmed that identification procedures had been rushed, that staffing was thin, and that the assumptions made in a grief-soaked room had become part of permanent record without adequate verification. A formal inquiry convened, and I sat through hearings that were at once bureaucratic and profoundly human. Witnesses gave testimony, some apologetic, some defensive. A few admitted error. Others suggested that under the circumstances, night, storm, mass casualties, mistakes were almost inevitable. The inquiry did not absolve anyone automatically, but it did force institutions to acknowledge the possibility that a man had been misidentified and that the system had failed in ways that allowed exploitation to begin. Meanwhile, Tommy's therapy continued. He worked with neurologists and trauma specialists who slowly helped him process gaps and integrate memory fragments. Some nights remained dark, haunted by snow and the sound of metal and screams. Other nights, he remembered absurdly vivid domestic scenes: Mom's crooked garden gate, the texture of a worn armchair, the cadence of our mother's speech. Sometimes the memories rushed back with a clarity that made us both gasp. Other times they were teasing wisps that vanished when reached for. Sandra pursued civil avenues while the inquiry moved in a public forum. She filed claims against entities and individuals where evidence suggested culpability. Lawsuits are slow mechanisms for accountability, often fraught with legal hurdles, but they can also force discovery, compelled document production, depositions under oath, and sworn testimony that makes it harder for officials or proprietors to hide behind faded memory. The legal process was exhausting and expensive, but it began to reveal patterns of neglect and informal labor arrangements that had existed for years. Through the legal motions, we uncovered more concrete leads: payroll records that omitted certain workers, travel logs showing unusual stops near the crash site, and a ledger that hinted at payments made in cash to unnamed laborers. None of these alone was conclusive, but together they formed a mosaic that suggested organized exploitation. The specter of corporate indifference, of people profiting from nameless labor, became less abstract and more prosecutable. As lawsuits and inquiries unfolded, the past was no longer just memory. It became a subject of legal scrutiny that promised truth, but also promised new battles and unforeseen pain. Months turned into a year of hearings, therapy, and long drives between clinics and courtrooms. In time, some outcomes crystallized. Certain individuals accepted responsibility for turning a blind eye and offered settlements that funded Tommy's care and rehabilitation programs for other exploited workers. The coroner's office amended records where it could, including a note to explain how misidentification might have occurred given the chaos. None of this erased trauma or the years lost, but it offered institutional recognition that a wrong had been done and that institutions could be accountable. Tommy's progress was slow but real. He found small rhythms, a job at a garden center where soil under his nails felt like a harmless kind of proof that he was part of the world again, evenings with our grandchildren where his laugh came easier, and sessions with a therapist that helped stitch memory into continuity. Sometimes he would stand staring at a photograph and then exclaim with wonder about a detail only the real Tommy would know. Other times he would retreat into silence and nightmares. We learned to navigate both the leap of joy and the persistence of sorrow. We debated what to do with the grave that had borne his name. In the end, we left it as a marker for the life everyone had thought ended, a memorial to the boy who had once been lost, and now a place for him to visit if he chose. We marked new milestones too, a small ceremony when a settlement funded community outreach, a ribbon cutting for a clinic program aimed at transient laborers, and moments of quiet where Tommy would tell a story about a childhood memory and we would all listen like congregants hearing a miracle. In quieter moments, I would think about how fragile identity can be when records, names, and institutions fail the vulnerable. My mother had died thinking her son was gone. That was an ache I could never fully fix. But we had found one another, and that mattered beyond measure. Tommy was not wholly the boy I had known, nor was he an exact stranger. He was both, a man remade by hardship, with pockets of the old self peeking through. One evening, after a long day of appointments, we sat on the back deck watching the lake pull light into its surface. Tommy asked, "Do you think Mom knows?" I told him I believed she did. He smiled, small, real, and less guarded than it had been. In the end, the story became about more than a misidentified body. It became about systems that fail, about the resilience of a human life, and about the stubborn work of piecing a person back together when the world has been negligent. We learned to be brothers again, imperfectly and courageously. The past would always lodge itself between us like a stone, but we had learned how to move around it, together. The truth had been messy and costly, but in reclaiming my brother, we also began to build safeguards so fewer lives would disappear into the margins again.